Hello, everybody, and welcome to Profiling Evil Podcasts, Cults Among Us. Today, I'm talking with Paul Murphy, a former television reporter who pursued cult leaders and their religions for years in the state of Utah. He carried his passion over to the Attorney General's office, where he worked tirelessly to set up Operation Safety Net, a multidisciplinary group of government agencies, NGOs, law enforcement, and get this, polygamists. The mission to identify problems in polygamous communities and develop strategies to provide services to them. So let's talk cults among us. Paul, welcome to Profiling Evil.
Thanks, Mike. It's really great to see you and to join you. I look forward to the conversation.
Well, you've been a friend for a lot of years, and I'm really looking forward to learning more about some of the work that you did in the AG's office after I left. You are a homegrown Utah man, and you've had interactions, interestingly, with polygamy through most of your youth. So I want to start out with, what did you think about this group of people, these polygamists, and how differently they were from you? They certainly dressed differently. And, you know, they were the subject of a lot of closed-door discussions and whispers among people in our communities.
And that's a good way to put it. I mean, they were always the others, or, I mean, they really seemed like aliens to me because they wouldn't talk to me. I was afraid to talk to them. I grew up in Bountiful, and the Kingsons had, which was a very large polygamous group in Utah, had a place called the Co-op, where they sold Levi's and clothing. And when you would go in there, they would have a lot of children working at the store, but there was only one woman who would actually talk to you. And so very limited interaction. And then when I went on in high school and worked at Lagoon, you would see these people showing up in their prairie dresses, and they just looked so different. And I didn't know how to even approach them or even how to talk to them. And so it really wasn't until I was a reporter that I had a chance to actually talk to someone who was a polygamist and really get to know them and move from being just people who were others into people who I actually considered dear friends.
You know, that's really interesting. So think back to when you were a boy. Did you ever have discussion with your folks about the polygamists in the Co-op store, or frankly, when you saw them at Lagoon? And then I'm going to ask you a second question to maybe answer as part of all that. And did you get caught up in some of the backdoor discussions when you saw these kids walking around in their prairie dresses, especially when you were there with a pack of your buddies?
Well, it probably wasn't kind, the things we said about them, but just because they were different. And it didn't seem that far-fetched, but I just couldn't believe that anybody would be practicing it right now.
Hey, folks, for those of you who are just joining, I'm speaking with Paul Murphy, a former reporter who pursued cult leaders for years in trying to get stories about their life in polygamy. He carried his passion over to his work in the Attorney General's office and now into private work today. We're talking about closed societies. And Paul, as we've been kind of launching into this discussion, I think it's kind of interesting. You and I were on different career paths in the late 1980s and early 1990s. I was, 13 or so years into my career as a police officer. I was working in the county attorney's office. You were one of the biggest names in field reporting for one of Salt Lake City's largest news agencies. And as I often say, as fate or destiny would have had it, you started getting assignments to cover some of the biggest ritual crime cases in the state. And I remember one story in particular about you covering a case surrounding the murder of polygamous leader Rulon Allred, a big, big name in the polygamy environment in Utah. Tell everyone about that story and help them get to know a little bit about the AUB, or the Apostolic United Brethren sect.
Well, the Apostolic United Brethren was at the time the second largest polygamous group in the United States, and probably today is the largest. Rulon Allred was killed by 3 women who came into his. I believe he was a chiropractor who came in, shot him, killed him, and the women were acquitted. And then one of the killers, Rena Shanath, wrote a book about it because she had been tried and found not guilty of murder. She wrote a book about how she committed the murder. Well, the Allreds actually sued her. And so that was actually my first chance to talk to polygamists. I went to the civil court hearing, and the Allred family was very kind to me, answered my questions, made me feel at home. And it was really my first interaction talking to polygamists. And, they won their case. Rena Shanath never even showed up for court. And that set me on a path where I started to find out about other polygamist groups in Utah. There was an author at the time, his name was Ogden Kraut, and he wrote a lot of books about fundamental Mormonism and about polygamists. And he kind of became my go-to guy to tell me about the different organizations, who was who. And that's where I learned about and got to know a lot of the bigger polygamist groups, and also some of the smaller ones that were trying to set up different communities, or basically closed communities throughout the state of Utah.
So when you were looking at the Allred group in particular, and if I go back in my history brain, the AUB was a spinoff from the original Colorado City Hilldale group when there were some differences in doctrine. Do you remember much about that transition and why they split off? And then they ended up in the South Salt Lake Valley area, didn't they, as their main headquarters?
Right, in the Bluffdale area. And most of them trace their history back to around Colorado City and Colorado City, Arizona, Hilldale, Utah, which are twin cities in the Arizona-Utah border. But they actually lived throughout Utah, and most of the groups were fairly united when the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints finally ended the practice of polygamy. And at that point, these people carried on that tradition. And, it's interesting when you go into their churches, you see the different presidents of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And then at some point, you start seeing other people, people that you have not seen before. And so the different groups have different leaders, and they split over doctrine. They also split over leadership. There was a major split in the 1980s, a group that is now living in Centennial Park, Arizona. They split off over the issue of one-man rule, because they had a kind of a council ruling. And at that time, Rule and Jeffs said, no, I am the leader, and the rest of the group split off and they started a different group.
Yeah, it's really interesting when you go back in history. And folks, for those of you who are wondering, the groups that we're talking about are not Latter-day Saints of the mainstream Latter-day Saint faith. These are groups that peeled away, and the primary reason they peeled away is they wanted to continue to practice polygamy and believed that it should be practiced. In 1890, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints said, no longer will we practice polygamy. It was a few years after that until the church started excommunicating people who refused to follow that counsel. And that created these groups that ended up splitting off. And I'm glad you brought up the one-man rule, because I found that interesting in the FLDS religion. It always reminded me, my love for Egypt, but it always reminded me of the same kind of the thing that happened to the Amun priests when when the new pharaoh Akhenaten determined that there was only one God and only one voice that made decisions, not the Amun priests, who, in my opinion, they would have worshiped Pepsi cans if somebody would have said we should worship a Pepsi can too. I mean, they just went after everything.
And that's an area of expertise I know nothing about, Mike. So I will defer to you another day.
Now here's another wacky question, though. I had no idea. I didn't remember that Rulon Allred was a chiropractor. And of course, the Lafferty brothers practice chiropractics, and maybe we'll get into a time sometime. Well, I'll tell you when Dan offered to crack my back and neck while we were in prison talking, and I declined. You might guess.
Wow. Yeah. No. I mean, it's interesting among the fundamentalist Mormons is that you see a lot of naturopaths and chiropractors because they have been isolated, and so they distrust medicine. Um, they distrust authority, and so that was if we talk a little bit later about our conversations, um, it was hard to build trust among them because they didn't trust us, and frankly, we didn't trust them either. And so there was a kind of a mutual distrust going on.
Yeah, agreed. Well, so not much dust settled after that case with Rulon Allred before our paths really started intersecting, Paul. And you did a story on the resentencing of a ritual murderer named Ron Lafferty. This was another case of ritual crime that rocked the state of Utah. Can you talk a little bit about that case from your perspective and what your angle was in reporting at that time?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, Ron and Dan Lafferty, who are featured prominently in a book called Under the Banner of Heaven, which is about to be a major TV series, a book by John Krakauer. Uh, they had they set off and decided that they were prophets, and they created a hit list, and they planned to kill a bunch of people, and they started by killing uh, a BYU student, their niece, who they thought was interfering with Ron's marriage. So they killed her,
And actually, I'll just make one quick correction, Paul. It was Brenda Lafferty, Allen's wife, their sister-in-law.
and Brenda Lafferty. I actually went to BYU to study journalism, and she was a student there just a few years prior, and and a broadcast journalism student as well. And anyways, I remember covering the different hearings for Ron Lafferty, and I was just so angry at him, and and he would just mock the judge, and I remember at the time, if I had a brick, I would have threw it at him and hit him in the head. But then when I finally met him in prison and interviewed him, and for some reason, I just had a completely different uh, feeling about him. Not that what he did wasn't evil, because I'd seen the videos of Brenda Lafferty and her baby daughter with their throats slit, and was horrified by his crimes. But I was also sad that a man that once was very intelligent, once had a promising career, had really deluded himself and thrown his life away, had hurt so many other people. And I felt sad. I felt sad for him. I didn't want to throw a brick at him anymore, but I just wished he had chosen a different path.
Isn't it interesting? I mean, both the Lafferty brothers and Dan to this day still remains rather charismatic when you visit with them, which is part of the appeal as they start to build and create these cults that surround them and get people to believe in their ideology and to follow along. I remember reading a talk by a real influential person in my life that was called "When Our Strengths Become Our Weaknesses." And this is an exact example of that, when something that is such a strength literally becomes the weakness and causes a downfall of a person. This is where it really gets fun for me, because it was shortly after that you and I actually became friends. It was all surrounding the Zion Society. And I've talked about the Zion Society on this show before. And folks, by the way, you can go back and watch my interviews with Dan Lafferty, including my interview from prison with him just a few months ago, where we retraced all of the steps surrounding the murders of Brenda and Erica, and the ideology and the belief system they had then, and that Dan purports to still have today. Still thinks he's Elijah the prophet, Paul, and I suspect he'll go to his grave believing that. But we met during the Zion Society. And I'd like you just to take a little bit of time and tell people from your perspective about that case. And then we'll go off and chat about some other wacky cases you've handled during your career.
Well, I think the Zion Society was unique in the fact that they were in our midst, and they looked like everybody else. They didn't look like polygamists. They were folks who looked like anybody else you would know on the street. Their homes were immaculate. The gardens were absolutely incredible surrounding their homes. And when you'd see them, you'd think, boy, they look like anybody else I've ever seen. They didn't look like the people in the prairie dresses and the cowboy clothes. And so when I got to know some of the people of the Zion Society and started talking to them, it was obvious that there was something very different going on. And it was just shocking to hear, because I mean, just the amount of abuse that was going on with the children, the idea of these sister councils where women were being swapped from different men to different people, that children were being swapped to different groups. And then when I finally met some of the children, I remember we did an interview with one of the cult members and her daughter, was very, very sexualized and seemed to be flirting with our cameraman, who was quite a bit older, had gray hair and a gray beard. And it was very, very, I don't know what the word for it. It was creepy.
Yeah, I was going to say, how about creepy or disturbing or disgusting? Because I remember that same thing and thinking, how can a child be so sexualized and so good at flirting?
Right. Yeah, it was very disturbing and very the rationalization that they had, that we're not doing anything wrong, that this is God's will, that we're just trying to do what God wants us to do, and yet what they were doing was completely terrorizing and destroying the lives of these kids.
All of that, the rumors had been circling around Ogden for almost a decade about this group slowly gaining ground. The neighbors were troubled. In fact, I remember neighbors putting signs up that said specifically, "We're not one of them." And but had it not been for journalists, I don't know that law enforcement would have ever found the right angle to start looking at this case. And it's a real fine line that you played in the world of journalism that you later learned from a criminal justice standpoint. Talk a little bit about that.
Well, I appreciated your friendship at the time. You were with law enforcement, and law enforcement traditionally doesn't trust journalists. And so I appreciate that we had a relationship, that I knew that you could tell me things and I could tell you things that were only going to stay with us, because primarily, I think, first and foremost, we were concerned about the children, and that the people who perpetrated these crimes received justice. And so I remember getting to know them, and always, I mean, to this day, I always think that relationships are always more important than getting the big scoop or getting, just any sort of accomplishment. If you destroy a relationship in the process, then you really haven't accomplished anything. And so with you, with the victims, with some of the courageous investigators, Phil and Cheryl Noggle, with some of the family members who were trying to get their kids out of this cult, they really became really close friends, and I really grew to love them and wanted to protect them and try to help them in any way that I could. The answer was that I just, I obviously I was there to tell a story, because I think the public benefits from knowing about these groups, and one, to protect themselves, but also, I mean, I think it's one of those stories that, this could happen to me. I mean, people always, and I appreciate it in your book, which, by the way, I just finished reading. People who join cults are not crazy people. They're not stupid people. They're people who just want to belong, and they actually want to do the right thing, but then they're manipulated, and there are certain techniques that are used that change them from people who are rational to being very irrational and doing things that normal people just would never do.
it's such a reminder to me of how important the press is in a true free society. We're watching this happen with what's going on globally right now and how people can be kept from information. We even had threats of that in our own country a few years ago when there were attempts to try to control and stop the press. There were many times, as you well know, that I was angry as could be because the press released something that I wanted to hold as a card. Never did I have anyone in the press, and I use you as an example, that violated the trust of this can't be shared yet, but here's where we're going. But every once in a while, unknowingly, information came out, but that's just part of the game we play. So tell me about some of the other criminal cases that you looked into. Let's talk about another polygamous group called the Kingstons that were, again, another break off of that original LDS group.
Right. So the Kingstons they are an interesting group, and they're very powerful. They own a lot of businesses. They have millions of dollars, but most of their members actually live in very meager homes. And I actually have a lot of friends who are members of the Kingston group. Some are active members of the church, and some are not. But they have a unique belief system where they believe that they are from a divine lineage. And that so there is a lot of marrying that goes on between very close relatives, and because there is that perception that they are being persecuted by others, they are very isolated. And again, they look a little bit different, but they live also among us. They run businesses here in the Salt Lake Valley and throughout the Intermountain West. But they have very unique beliefs. They believe that they are, they are the one true church, and they practice polygamy. They also tend to marry very, very close relatives, and so their family trees just look like this. I mean, they're just so mixed up. A person would be married to a young girl who would be his cousin, his stepsister, his aunt, his niece. I mean, it was just incredible when you try to figure out how many different ties they would have. And I remember talking to one Kingston about that, and they said, well, the British, they married their close relatives as well with their royalty. And so they thought that was an okay thing to do. But I remember talking to a geneticist, and we've seen this with other polygamous groups that have a lot of intermarrying going on, is that there's some severe genetic problems that happen when you marry close relatives.
Yeah, absolutely, and evidenced by, and let's talk about some of the stories you remember from the FLDS community and that baby cemetery, and proven genetic evidence that supported the fact that created a real genetic problem that caused a much higher incident of birth defects and pre-birth deaths than anywhere in the world because of polygamy.
Right. Yeah. And I have a lot of friends who live down in Colorado City and Hilldale, and there are a lot of children who are very disabled because of those genetic problems. You mentioned, going back to the Kingstons, the case that I covered was a man was charged with beating his 15-year-old daughter because she refused to stay married to her uncle. And so the girl ran away. She went to authorities. She ended up testifying against her dad, who beat her, but also against the uncle who sexually assaulted her. And it was a riveting case. It was one of those few trials that you went to where there was a Perry Mason moment where they had his ex-wife say, "No, I was actually the person in the hotel. I'm the one who was there, and I did everything." And so they asked her to describe the hotel room, and she described it one way, and then they had the actual victim describe what the hotel room looked like. Then they brought in the hotel manager who described what the hotel room actually looked like, and it was just like, ah. So anyways, he was convicted.
That is awesome. Well, So let's talk about the FLDS and Centennial Park. And again, folks, this is a group that, as Paul mentioned earlier, in the '80s there was a division in the minds of leadership. Rulon Jeffs was now the leader of the FLDS, and decided that rather than governing decisions being made by a body of men who were called to be leaders of the church, Jeffs decided that no, God has indicated that I'm now the prophet. First time, actually, I think they used the word prophet in the FLDS, and then of course Jeffs estranged an entire group that has spun off and financially is an incredible enterprise, and of course a church of their own.
Rulon Jeffs really changed things by the one man rule, and then he became, but and he started marrying a lot of women and a lot of young girls, and then he became incapacitated. And his son Warren, he started speaking on behalf of Rulon, and the doctrines just kept getting more tight and tight and tight, more control, and the perversion just kept getting worse and worse and worse. And you talked about the Zion Society and how you kept hearing these rumors about these things might be going on. Well, as a reporter, I heard rumors about what was going on in the FLDS church for a lot of years. And turns out those rumors were true. And in fact, they were worse than I ever could have imagined, about the number of young girls who were raped by older men, by eventually the women who were told that they could no longer have marital relations with their own husbands, and that there were a select small group of men who that they could have sex with if they were going to want to continue having children. And these people very much want to have children because they consider that part of their salvation and exaltation into heaven.
I found that so interesting, Paul, that when Jeffs came out with that revelation, Warren Jeffs from prison, that the husbands and wives were no longer to have relationships with each other, all sex was cut off, in a church that only grew by generational relationships, he was in essence also putting the kiss of death on it if that revelation stayed in place.
Well, and he was in prison, so he could no longer be having sex with all the different women and young girls. And but it was just a matter of control. And I mean, he took over control over everything. At one point, he divided up everybody, and they all had to come into this big giant building where they were stripped of all their clothing, stripped of everything that they owned, and then they were determined whether they were part of this new united order. And so you had people who were deemed worthy and those who were deemed unworthy. And those who were deemed unworthy were not given food, were not given anything. And I just remember hearing these horrible stories of mothers being inside their homes with their families eating dinner. And like a 10-year-old kid would have to stay outside. He couldn't have any food. He couldn't be part of the family because he was not considered worthy. It was, I mean, it's just awful. I mean, yeah, no, it was hideous. I remember Tucker Carlson taking great issue that Warren Jeffs was on the FBI's top 10 wanted list, but Warren Jeffs committed genocide. He destroyed 30,000 people. He destroyed thousands of women, thousands of children, and the men who were also under his leadership. I mean, he destroyed a lot of people.
Let's move up the state a little bit into a church that I think I worked a couple of news stories with you and certainly tried to solve a few problems. That's Jim Harmston and the True and Living Church.
So it was interesting reading your book and your dealings with him. So I met Jim Harmston when he had a kind of a discussion group going on, and he was an active member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And then at some point he was excommunicated because he started privately preaching about polygamy. And then about 2 years later, he showed up at the Sunstone Symposium, and the Sunstone is a magazine basically for Mormon intellectuals who take a very intellectual look towards the history and the doctrines of the Mormon Church and the different splinter groups. And he showed up. He says, "God appeared to me, and I'm the new prophet, and I've started a church, and I'm here to announce it today." And then I looked at some of the people who were standing next to him, and some of the women were from the Zion Society. And so I was like, what?
So when you read my book and you knew exactly who I was talking about when they called me a damnable devil.
Yes, yes, I did. And I mean, I was shocked because they went from bad. Well, it's hard to say which was worse, but Jim Harmson, same thing. He went from being kind of just a guy that was in your neighborhood to suddenly he was marrying 14-year-old girls, and and he went from like being this very open polygamist where he invited TV cameras in. He showed everybody how well polygamy could be lived and how he was a different kind of polygamist. And then suddenly he started getting more secret and more isolated. And then he started having very, very young wives and having sexual relations with very young girls.
It just feels like you leave one group to go get a Coke and you come back in a different group, but it's the same story over and over again.
Yeah. And it's interesting. There is some safety in belonging to a cult because you don't have to make the decisions. Most of the things are taken care of, and your decisions are made for you. So for some, it's a very stress-free life, but you give up a lot for that sense of safety.
Hey folks, you're listening to my interview with retired reporter Paul Murphy, who now provides help to those living in or trying to escape from closed societies. In this case, we're talking polygamy. I want to pause for a moment and remind you that if you're interested in learning more about cult behavior and cult dynamics, please go out and pick up my book, Deceived, an investigative memoir of the Zion Society cult. Deceived chronicles my investigation and ultimate takedown of a religious cult that committed, get this folks, more than 4,000 assaults against adult women and children before we arrested and convicted 12 kingpins. But for me, the real story is about some of the 32 child survivors who rose above the abuse and built productive lives. The book explores cult recruiting tactics and how seemingly intelligent people can be convinced to commit crimes. You can get signed hardbound copies of Deceived at profilingevil.com, or you can get paperback and ebook at Amazon. Now let's get back to my discussion with Paul Murphy. Paul, let's talk a little bit about your experiences with the Utah Attorney General's office. Your experiences in polygamy were just the beginning as you took over the role of public outreach and media relations in the state's highest law enforcement office.
Right. So when I started the Attorney General's office, the Attorney General asked me to set up the Amber Alert system in Utah. And so I actually used my experience as a reporter to bring broadcast journalists and law enforcement to work together with the common goal of bringing home abducted children. And so a year later, the Attorney General of Utah, the Attorney General of Arizona held a polygamy summit. And essentially they brought in hundreds of people to discuss about all the problems that were going on in polygamous communities. And so at this polygamy summit, they had one law enforcement side, and then they had kind of a social problem side. And I was in the room on the social problem side. And I just kept taking notes and had a big whiteboard up there and listed about 12 problems that were identified. And then at the end of it, I turned to the Attorney General and I said, well, what do you want to do about this? And he kind of like put up his shoulders, and I said, well, do you mind if I take a crack at it? And so I brought together law enforcement, government agencies, nonprofit groups who were concerned about polygamy. And then I did something that was very unusual, and it happened at the Polygamy Summit, because there were polygamists who showed up and they wanted to be part of the meeting, but they weren't allowed in. And they said, don't make decisions about us without us. And so we started what was called the Safety Net Committee. And we started having meetings to discuss the problems, but also to work together to come up with solutions. So we went through that list of 12 problems and started, how can we stop domestic violence within the polygamous communities? How can we stop children from being abused? How can we help polygamists get services that they need, but they're experiencing barriers from getting medical help, from getting food stamps? I mean, people always worry about polygamists taking advantage of food stamps. What we found was that a lot of polygamists were afraid to get them because they were so afraid of the government. They were afraid of social services. They had a lot of kids, a lot of hungry kids. They actually were entitled to help, and they needed help. And so we started talking about the problems, and through the years, a lot of close relationships were formed. We found that there were areas where we could not agree, and we would never agree, but we also found that there were a lot of areas where we could agree, and we could come up with solutions together to identify the problems, to find solutions, and to make a difference. And it really, it's probably the thing I'm most proud of in my life, because we really made some really groundbreaking changes in helping people who weren't talking with each other to talk with each other. And it was no longer us and them, it was us together solving issues. And what we found was that it was the government and the nonprofit groups who actually needed the most education. We thought we were there to go educate them. They actually needed to educate us because we didn't understand them or how to help them.
Now, you helped two people that I'd like you to talk about a little bit, because they've written some books. And I'd talk about Carolyn Jessup and Elisa Walls.
So Elisa, well, actually, Carolyn Jessup was the first. She came to us and said, I escaped. And it's, if you remember the movie Sophie's Choice, she basically had to make a choice between, two children, one to save and one not to save. And Carolyn had to make that same choice. She was trying to leave. I mean, she really did have to escape, and her book is called Escape. She had to escape from the FLDS in the middle of the night. She took her children, but she had one daughter who was screaming and jeopardized Carolyn from being able to take all of her children out of that home. And so she had to leave that one daughter behind. Eventually, she was able to get that daughter. But she showed up at the Attorney General's office and she said, I want you to help me get my children. This guy is marrying other young women. I'm afraid my girls are going to be married off to older men. I need your help. And so we were able to help her. And she became the inspiration basically for the safety net. It's like, we really don't have a good system in place to help people get help. And so we were able to help her. She was able to get custody of her children. Her one daughter finally did end up living with her, and for a couple of years still wore the prairie dresses, still was mad at her mom, still wanted to be with her father, but eventually did get an education. And Carolyn and all of her kids have gone on to do great things. Elisa Wall was married to her sister's husband. She was a 15-year-old girl, and she didn't want to be married to him. And so she also left, and she ended up becoming a witness against her husband and against Warren Jeffs. And through the safety net, we were able to apply for a grant. We were able to get her a place where she could stay so that the FLDS would not come try to get her or try to convince her not to testify. And she's a remarkable woman. She's now in an organization helping other women from polygamous groups trying to get help that they need.
It's amazing. You accomplish so much through Safety Net, and you touch so many groups, but you also had pushback from a few groups like Tapestry and a few others. Anything you want to say about that?
Well, it was very strange, because originally I thought that Tapestry and these other anti-polygamy groups would be my allies. And instead they ended up becoming my chief critics, because they said, why are you talking to polygamists? They really shouldn't even be in the same room. I mean, I remember they kept saying it's like inviting rapists to a rape crisis center. And, people have this idea that every polygamist is a child abuser. Every polygamist is a domestic violence perpetrator. And they're not. There are a lot of really dear people who live and believe in polygamy. And so those are the people that we worked with to try to help those who may be victims of crime or may be perpetrating crime. And so we worked with them, and we were able to meet solutions. We didn't have to start each meeting saying, you're a member of a cult, you're a bad person, we hate you. We actually became their friends and tried to find ways where we could work together. We didn't agree on everything, but we agreed enough that we could solve problems and to help women, children, and the men living within polygamous communities. So it was hard. I remember going to the International Cultic Studies Association, and the folks from Tapestry were there, and they were still mad at me. And I spent probably an entire day talking to one person because I actually still cared about those relationships. I wanted them to know my heart, and that I also detested child abuse. I did detest domestic violence, but I still loved the people living within polygamous communities.
I talked to Kristen Decker a few days ago. She called me to tell me she just read Deceived and wanted to talk about a few things. And folks, this is a woman who escaped polygamy, was a polygamist wife, and has written an incredible book called Her 50 Years in Polygamy. But one of the things that Kristen told me about—
Kristen Decker, by the way.
You what?
I love Christine Decker. She's an amazing woman.
She is a rock star. And actually, we're going to be interviewing her in a few weeks, so that'll be fun to follow up with you after that's done. But Kristen and I talked about when she went on Sister Wives with one of her former associates. And I found it kind of interesting because if I remember right, you had a really close relationship with Cody Brown and the Sister Wives, women of the Sister Wives reality TV show. And you tried to talk them out of doing that show. Why don't you talk a little bit about that?
Well, yeah, no, I loved Cody Brown. I loved his wives and became really close to them. And I remember going to his house, and it's the first time I ever watched a pay-per-view MMA fight. It was at his house. And, they had all these kids and people running around. And so we got to be good friends. I remember going to lunch and dinner with him and his wife, Christine, several times. And then he showed up at the Attorney General's office and said, I've been asked to do this reality show. And I just said, don't do it. I said, look at Ozzy Osbourne, look at the Kardashian, look at any of those families. None of the families remain intact after a reality TV show. They end up hating each other. And I said, it's good that you want people to see your life and let people know that you're not a monster, but I don't think your family is going to survive it. And the sad truth is his family isn't surviving it. They're all breaking up, and it's too bad. I don't, marriage, as you and I know, marriage is hard. Marriage with several partners just sounds impossible and incredibly difficult. And then throw in a reality TV show, and I don't know how anyone could survive that. And
well, and imagine for, let's say, the families that followed Warren Jeffs and all of a sudden realized what a deviant, disgusting pedophile he was that was leading them. And as a very good friend of both of ours said, there was no exit plan when the prophet fails and falls and the church is discovered to be, the doctrine is discovered to be problematic. There's still children that have moms and dads that they love, and people that love each other. How do you pick up the pieces after something like that? I don't know. But Paul, you left the Attorney General's office a few years ago to chase some other opportunities professionally. but you didn't leave polygamy. You've remained heavily involved in providing support to the polygamous communities ever since then. So tell everybody a little bit about the work you're doing today.
Well, one of the great things that I learned while we had the safety net was that the government really can't do everything, and they really shouldn't. And so there are other organizations who have stepped forward. One of the best organizations I know is called Holding Out Help. And if you get a chance, go to holdingouthelp.org. But they really, really have helped people from the polygamous communities, and they provide help whether you want to leave or whether you want to stay. I actually went to a fundraiser with them a couple of weeks ago and ran into one of Tom Green's wives. And she doesn't remember me, but I remember her. I was the first person to report that Tom Green became the first polygamist to actually be charged with polygamy in like 40 years, and got to know him, got to know his wives really well, but they were just young girls. And it was interesting to see how she has been able to reclaim her life and to get the help she needed and to get the counseling she needed. Holding Out Help is, when I was reading your book and reading about how there's this desperate need for counseling, Holding Out Help provides therapists and counselors to help these women and children. And they've done just, they're doing God's work as far as helping people right now. And so she has gone on. But when I brought up that I knew her when she was this little girl married to Tom Green, I just saw the pain in her face. And she goes, I just don't like to think about that time anymore. It was still just so painful for her. And so when I read your book and about them recounting those early memories, I just saw in their faces how hard it was to still, it's still very, very painful. And they need, and I hope they get, and I'm hoping some of those people from the Zion Society would look to Holding Out Help to get additional counseling and resources.
Yeah, it's tragic because you were right earlier, and I failed to comment on this, that when the profit and structure was destroyed during the arrests, it left people still looking for a place to belong and a place to control them in many cases. And so they went from one polygamous community to another, or one closed society to another. And I suspect that will remain, and probably is the fundamental part of these kinds of fundamentalists, is that they still want to be the kind of people that believe they're closer to God, that they have more light and knowledge, that they are a little more special than the rest of us, and that their pathway is secure, while the rest of us just kind of glump along and hope we somehow make it to heaven or wherever our ultimate happy zone is.
Yeah, no, and I just want to put one more plug in for your book, because there was, I think I told you, there was just this aha moment when I read in your book, and it was when Arvin Shreve was asked by the police officers what could they do differently. He said this, and I'm just going to quote from your book. He said, "If you take down the barriers and build some rapport with the people, talk to them, get to know them, let's use a little common sense and try to break down the barriers of isolation and get to know people a little better. Maybe then we can prevent a lot of these awful problems from arising." And that's what we tried to do with the safety net. And what I see Holding Out Help doing now is that they're breaking down the barriers. They're not treating people as hideous human beings, but as human beings that need help, who need help. And I don't have a lot of great things to say about Arvin Shreve, but I thought that was a remarkable moment where he offered some clarity about how to help people. Yeah, no, that doesn't surprise me at all. And it's interesting, his voice and Warren Jeff's voice and the way they both spoke was very similar, very soft spoken, very sing songy. And anyways, there are tapes of Warren Jeff's where he's talking to these young girls before he rapes them, and it's just horrifying.
Yeah. Well, our time is spent, but I want to ask you just a couple more things. The news media, and frankly, all of us, often focus on these extreme examples when we're talking about cults. And I guess my question for you is, in your opinion, are cults always harmful?
That's a good question. Steve Hassan, who's an expert on mind control and cults, uses what's called the bite model, which is if a group controls your behavior, your information, your thoughts, and your emotion in a way that's destructive to yourself, then you are a member of a self-destructive cult. As a parent, you also use the bite model where you control your children's behavior, information, thoughts, and emotions, but you're doing it in a helpful way. So we're both doing the same thing, but one can be harmful and one can be awful. And they don't always have to be religious cults. There are business cults, there are self-help cults. There are cults of 2 or 3 people. So, there's a psychological term of a cult. And if they're using self-destructive means, then yeah, a cult is always harmful. But if someone is controlling a person in a way that helps the person become better, then more power to them.
No, it really does. And so I guess here's a little curveball for you as we kind of close out. If you happen to step onto an elevator for an 8-floor rise, and that person was a member of a destructive cult, knowing what you've come to know, and if they asked you the question of what advice would you have for me, what would you say to them?
I would say, how can I help you? How can I be your friend? What information can I give you, or what can you tell me so that we both each understand each other, so that we become friends? Relationships are always the key. It's always best that you get to know people and understand where they're coming from, and letting them know information. I've heard it, and I'm giving this more than a 30-second elevator pitch, but
we're stopping on every floor.
Okay, well, there are 2 times when a person will leave or think about leaving a closed society or a tightly closed group, and that's the first 20% when they are investigating the group, and that 20% when they're thinking of leaving the group. If you're in that middle 60%, there is no way you're going to have a discussion where you can discuss facts and say, no, let me show you how you're wrong. It's not going to make a difference. So during that 60% time, that's also the time you just become their friend, so that when they consider that maybe the information they're receiving isn't true or isn't helpful, that they will know to come to you and trust you, that you will have their best interests at heart. So I guess during that elevator ride, I would want them to know that I'm their friend, that I care about them as a person, that even though we may believe differently, I can still learn to love them, and that we can find common ground where we can still be friends.
Well, folks, you can see why I think so highly of Paul Murphy, my longtime friend. And I want to thank you, Paul, for taking time out of your busy schedule to talk about your experiences dealing with these closed societies, particularly polygamy. Folks, what are your thoughts about today's discussion? I mean, would there be less mysticism surrounding polygamy if there was more transparency into their lifestyles? And frankly, is it anybody's business if they aren't committing crimes? I want to comment that in Utah, polygamy has been decriminalized, but don't ever mistake that move to decriminalize polygamy with encouraging or supporting the abuse of children or the abuse of adults. That decriminalization process was never in a way to somehow justify those horrid crimes that occur against young children who are forced to do things that they don't choose to do. I'm going to be watching for your comments down below, and I hope you'll take time to explore the website that Paul gave. And Paul, if you send me some additional websites, we'll put them in the description bar below.
Thanks, Mike. I also appreciate your efforts to help people from polygamous groups. I mean, they're some dear people, and they deserve our help, and they deserve our understanding.
Well, thanks. Folks, if you like this episode, make sure you're hitting that like and subscribe button, and most importantly, share it with your contacts and your personal networks. You can subscribe to Profiling Evil podcasts on your favorite podcast platform. And if you're interested in learning a little more about criminal profiling and the investigative analysis process, I hope you'll consider joining the Profiling Evil Academy. Links are down below, and you can always find us on YouTube, Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. Thanks for supporting us, and we'll see you all soon at the next crime scene.